The heat wave has finally broken. We were supposed to have like 2 days above 90 degrees, and then it stretched to like 5. And we don't have air conditioning. Today, this video is my July wrap-up. It is now August 1st. Alright, so in July I read 11 books, and only 3 of them were physical. So we'll get into it. So, okay, I'm going to talk about these 2 books together. So I read Sinner by Sierra Simone and Saint by Sierra Simone. These are books 2 and 3. I don't remember what the series is called. At the end of June I read book 1, which is Priest, and this is a erotic romance series. Book 1 follows a priest who falls in love with a woman, falls in infatuation, falls into temptation. He's falling in love and follows that. Book 2, Sinner, follows his brother, who is a like millionaire business playboy, as he falls for and gets involved with his best friend's little sister, who is about to take vows to become a nun, but she wants to have one last fling in the world. And then book 3 follows his next younger brother, who was also kind of a millionaire playboy, and then something happened and he decided to become a monk. And he is about to take final vows, and he's also deciding whether he wants to move to a more restrictive, more isolated monastery. And then his ex comes into his life, who happens to be his brother's best friend, who is the brother of the girl who's the nun. So everyone's super interconnected. So let's see. Let's talk about Sinner. So, of course I forget everybody's names. So he meets his best friend's younger sister at a function, doesn't realize who she is, flirts with her, and then finds out who she is. And he's like, oh shit, you're Zenny? You're that little like 7-year-old who used to always bother us? And she's like 22, 21, and he's like early 30s. So there's a little bit of an age gap there, but it's like not like a daddy kink kind of thing. So yeah, so she is, you know, a month away from taking final vows. And the other context of this book series is these brothers, they come from a family where when they were younger, their sister, when she was 16, she committed suicide because she was being sexually abused by their parish priest. So that's another added layer to this family's really fraught and complicated relationship with their faith and with the Catholic Church specifically. She's about to become a nun, and her mother superior, I think, has kind of been like, you know what, you're young enough that like you need to go out and like experience the world, you know, run your life through its paces to make sure that these things that you've never had, you're not going to regret later not being able to access them. Mother Superior, she knows what's up. And so Zenny then comes to her playboy, and she thinks that like because he's a playboy, he's kind of a safe bet in that she's like not gonna fall in love with him. He's gonna like show her a bunch of things, show her a good time. But because he does this all the time, they're not gonna get attached to each other, and it's not gonna be a big deal. And he's actually kind of falling for her, but the big question with like the romances in these stories is like, but how can I compete with God? How can I compete with your faith? Like the idea of like you have to choose one or the other is kind of the thing that these characters are always wrestling with. So some of the things that are specifically kind of discussed in this book is so like our playboy, he, especially because of like his family history, he was brought up Catholic but now has a really fraught relationship with especially like the concept of faith as an institution. But with that, like he has some weird notions about sex and morality and moral purity and stuff, and there's like some really great conversations about like, I just want to like read this one quote because I think it's an interesting conversation, and it's what I love about Sierra Simone's writing is she really kind of like unpacks a lot of our preconceived notions about like sex and religion and ritual and human connection. His brother's having a conversation with him. Tyler ignores me. You might think you're so liberated from the trap of Catholic morality, but you're still acting like a man who thinks sex is dirty. Like a man who believes in the concept of purity. I don't think sex is dirty, I sputter. I fuck literally all the time, I know. But listen to me. You can still fuck a lot and unconsciously believe these things. You can still smugly think you're better than all the people trapped in repressive paradigms, but still believe, deep down, that you have the capacity to taint another person. So that is something that like he's wrestling with, is he's kind of worried about like, you know, he's got like these outdated concepts of like virginity and purity, and like even though like he engages in certain behavior, he kind of still draws a line about the ways people engage in that behavior, and there's like a spectrum of it, rather than being like, where does that like spectrum come from? That's fucking arbitrary. Get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. So I love that. There's also a great line from the Mother Superior where our Playboy is kind of asking her about the way she's running things. He's like, what about like the bishop or the pope? Like, aren't you supposed to be obedient with them? The old woman snorts, and I look over in surprise. I'll be obedient to those bishops the day I die, and not a day sooner. At my expression, she huffs again. I'm obedient to God, and to my conscience, and to the poor. I'm obedient to my fellow sisters. And then under her breath, she mutters, obedient to men. Love that. More of that, please. Okay, I think I've kind of forgotten, like, what's the argument that makes, like, Zenny choose to leave, but part of it is having the Playboy kind of, like, understand and accept her faith and understand how she can have it in the face of the terrible things that are done in the name of faith, and, of course, both of them coming to a realization that, like, you know, your love of God and your love of a person, and you don't have, like, they can be wrapped up in the same thing. You don't have to choose just one. And, like, choosing to live a secular life rather than a religious life doesn't necessarily mean that, like, your faith is less. You're just, like, expressing it in a different way. Like, I love that, like, these, like, it's not just people realizing their attraction to each other, but it's realizing, you know, it's not like they're necessarily changing for the other person, but the existence of that other person is kind of like revealed something that needs to be worked on within themselves, and how, like, their relationship with that other person helps them to be a more whole, healthier version of themselves. It's great. It's great. And also, you know, frank relationships about religion and all that is fucked up about it, and the parts that, like, are not. Like, again, like, I love books that understand the distinction between faith and religion. You know, the concept of faith as, like, a guiding force in your life, and then religion as this institution that is built up of humans and all of their flaws. Book 3. Alright, so our main guy, our guy who wants to become a monk, is named Aiden, and his love interest is Elijah, who is the older brother of Zenny. Aiden, also known as Brother Patrick in his monastery, he went through a dark episode. It's a while before they say that it was, like, suicidal ideation, but it's pretty clear that, like, he was on the edge of something really dark that usually means suicidal ideation, and that's kind of, like, the triggering moment in his life that made him show up at the monastery in his pajamas and be like, I need to become a monk, or I need to become a monk, like, right now. And I like that we kind of take a while to, like, build up to that story and get through, like, the full events of it. But with that moment, what E.D.E did was basically like break up with Elijah over a text message and just abandon him. It's like 3 years later or 5 years later, and then Elijah is now engaged. So I think Elijah is kind of feeling unsure about this relationship, and he comes and visits E.D.E, and first part of the book, things happen and Elijah breaks off the engagement. But anyway, like with all that, there is so much discussion about mental health in this book, and also kind of like like discussing some outdated ideas within like the Catholic Church and monastic life, about like therapy and medication, and like the mix of like there's some ideas of like, well, you just like need to pray harder and God will fix you and fix your darkness. It's like, no, God also gave us like modern medicine. This is a belief in the book. I should probably say like I grew up Catholic, but I am no longer practicing or believing, but I find the concepts fascinating, just to separate me from what I'm talking about in the world of these books. So it's like, there's also the conversation like, okay, and God also gave us like modern medicine and therapy, and so what's the plot? So Elijah is a writer, and he has pitched and it's been accepted that he's going to tour these various monasteries with E.D.E, because all these monasteries brew beer, and they brew this really some of like the best beer in the world, but they brew it in small batches, and kind of talking about these isolated monasteries and the lives of the men there, and then also like talking about like the culture of the beer. And so that's his article. There's some awkwardness of like E.D.E having to deal with his ex, but it's also like fitting that right before he takes his final vows that he kind of has to deal with this unresolved relationship and his feelings towards this specific person. Oh, also I really love that in this circumstance, like his queerness, because E.D.E is they might both be. No, I think maybe Elijah is gay, but E.D.E is bisexual. A big thing they talk about is like within Catholicism is like it's only okay to be gay if you're abstinent, and like how fucked up that is. But I love that like within his like home monastery, like it's accepted that like abstinent or not, like that's a part of you, and like we're not going to think less of you or hold you to a different standard because of that, which maybe is very, very fictional, very fantasy, but I love that this book that deals with Christianity and Catholicism doesn't add like religious trauma to the queerness. Like they do talk about it, but like that's not the challenge of this book. These characters are allowed to be queer, and for the most part, be safe in that, and deal with faith, and not have the faith be a part that's dangerous. At least so like in this story. But in a way that doesn't ignore that this is kind of an anomaly. So I really like how she kind of crafted this specific storyline in these circumstances. So anyway, yeah, lots of mental health, and I think my favorite part is when E.D.E finally talks about the night where like the darkness threatened to consume him. So tons of trigger warnings for this book. Like, yes, tons and tons of sexy times, but like his specific conversation about suicide is up there. Is like in my top 3 conversations about suicide that I have like ever read. It's up there with Dear Sentaran by Akwaeke Emezi and I Hope We Choose Love by Kai Cheng Tom. And what makes them stand out is it's kind of like showing a side to suicide and depression and like not even about depression, but about like suicide and suicide ideation that's kind of like outside the norm of a lot of the conversations we see. A lot of the like I don't know what you call it, like the script that we are trained to say in the face of someone who's like considering suicide, of like, but like find something to live for, like people love you, like it's gonna get better, like we can help you, and like there's a lot of like that conversation that's like very appropriate for some people, but then like why these conversations that have kind of have this list of like these amazing conversations is they kind of show a side to suicide that's like so that like this conversation doesn't apply to, and it just kind of like expands how complex that drive within a person is. And like in reading it, it was like triggering might be like a bit far for what I was experiencing, but it was definitely a moment of like, oh fuck, you get it, this author gets it. But it was really good. I have to stress that, like, maybe that's not something that you feel like you can handle at this time, but if you think you can, I think this conversation is top tier. And I almost wish there was a version of this book with the sexy times toned down. I mean, they're great, trust me, but I kind of wish like there was a version with the sexy times toned down, just so more people would read it and would read like that specific passage, and then would also read all the conversations about like the Catholic Church and mental health and queerness, and just there's such great conversations in here that I want more people to read them, but I know the smut is gonna turn some people off. But also, like, kind of the point of some of the conversations of these books is like, but, you know, there is something sacred about that kind of physical intimacy between people, and why are we treating it as dirty? Anyway, I've talked, oh my god, I've been filming for almost half an hour and I've only talked about 2 books. Fuck. Love it. Great. Okay, continuing. Okay, then I read the ebook of A Dead Djinn in Cairo by Djeli Clark. This is a novella that's part of the Dead Djinn universe. So this takes place in an alternate history Cairo where magic exists in the form of Djinn have come through. Let's see, there's Djinn, there's Ifrit, there's Marid. There's these beings that call themselves angels, but there's always like a whole conversation about like, are they? They've never really like proven. We follow Fatma, who is a human. She is an investigator for the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities, and she dresses in like very Western style suits with like a cane and a bowler hat, and I can't believe I forgot about this character when I did my mid-month book freakout tag, when they talk about like what's your like your fictional crush. It's Fatma. Holy shit. Please. She's a fucking badass. I love her. So she's this investigator, and in A Dead Djinn in Cairo, she investigates. Of course, they find a djinn who is dead, has been drained of all of his blood. And then it's a novella, so it's kind of solving this mystery and building this world. And I think like the novella was like the perfect length of it, because like we do follow this mystery and figure out like what is the big like magical chaotic end of the world thing that's going to happen that they have to prevent. Also like kind of introduce you to this world which has a mix of like magical elements and kind of 1920s, not quite steampunk, but like they've got like tram cars and things like that, like technology is a little bit advanced. And then also I love that it's alternate history, because like Egypt is a world power. Very interesting world. I have and will continue to read more in the series. And yeah, I know someone like, I saw someone describe this world as like, it's kind of urban fantasy, it's kind of like Dresden Files vibes a little bit, and like, yeah, I do kind of get it. I do kind of get that. I think like the pacing and like the action sequences kind of fit the bill for that. But it's like queer woman of color lead, alternate history in Egypt, in Cairo. And there's a lot more like history, which I don't really have enough historical knowledge from that region and that time period to know what is consistent with our history and what is like inspired but is now changed. But it kind of makes me interested in like learning more about that region, so I can kind of see how well this world fits in it and what changes have been made to it. Okay. Next book I read, I listened to the audiobook for Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This wasn't a good fit for me at this time. I know there's a lot of people who really enjoy this one, but I know people also say I think this was maybe her first work that she actually wrote. And I struggled with it. I thought it would, because the title comes from, it's kind of a play on the like early Gothic horror novels that were popular at the time, and I thought like the whole book was kind of going to be a parody of that, and it's really like the last third where we actually finally go to Northanger Abbey and get a taste of like that parody of it. And the first part is just our heroine, who I do like her description of like, well, here's our heroine. She's not particularly pretty, or particularly smart, or adventurous, or stubborn, or much of anything. And I find it funny. I definitely find Jane Austen's like satire funny, and you definitely get a lot of satire of the society at the time. It's like our heroine goes to Bath with like her aunt or someone, and goes to parties there, and there's lots of conversations that are very much critiquing social norms and social expectations, and especially like the way that like men interact with women. But the downside of that is there's a lot of prattling, which the way that those conversations are like drawn out and very like fluffy and self-absorbed and like full of nothing, that's kind of what she's making fun of. But in order to do that, there needs to be paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of these just like mind-numbing conversations. So I struggled with that, where it's like I understand that this conversation is supposed to be like super boring and tone deaf and uninspiring. I know that's the point, but also like, holy shit, can you stop talking? Please, I don't care. So I struggle with it. I think it's just like where my brain is at the time. I read this because this is one of the last books that I have on my shelf from a time when I was going to a lot of little free libraries, and we had this mountain of books I had acquired, and then I'm like, all right, I need to actually read them and put them back before I can borrow more from the little free libraries in my neighborhood. So I just kind of wanted to get through it, but like for the most part, I just wasn't really interested in the story, and my expectations of it was again like dealing with like the Gothic horror elements, and it was actually like a very small part of the book. Most of it is just critiquing the social interactions of a season in Bath. So I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying like this is not for me at this time, and I'm glad it's done. Okay, next I listened to the audiobook for Magic Lessons by Alice Hoffman. This was narrated by Sutton Foster. And this is a prequel to Practical Magic, which I have seen the movie, I have not read the book. And this was fine. I think there's a lot in here about, it takes place in like early colonial, like, what is it, like 1600s Europe, and then colonial America, especially during the time of the Puritans and kind of like Salem witch trials, witch scare. So it's kind of like, you know, early historical witchcraft. And also there's a lot in here with like historical witchcraft in terms of, you know, making concoctions and making spells with like natural ingredients, and you know, there's a lot of like recipes in here. It's kind of like, you know, witchcraft 101 plus a historical plot line to go along with it. And I don't know, I just, especially now that it's been a couple weeks since I listened to it, I'm like, I'm not particularly pulled into the story. I kind of see how she's setting up some of the world that we then saw in Practical Magic, at least like the version of the story I saw from watching the movie like 15 years ago. I feel like this is fantasy for somebody who doesn't read a lot of fantasy, because it's kind of more about, at least this one is more about like mother relationships with her children, using magic for various purposes, as a discussion about like the nature of evil and evil intent, and like the historical context of being a woman without rights, without protection, and then also like being charged with witchcraft. Like, it's, I don't know, it's not like a very strong magic system. It's not the flavor of fantasy for me. We'll just put it that way. It's a bit mild for my taste. Great. Okay. Next, I read an arc from NetGalley. This is Night Ivy by E.D.E. Bell. This took me a little while to warm up to it. We follow a very neurodivergent mage. They never name what her conditions are, but given the way that she struggles with certain textures, like feelings, textures, the way that she gets overstimulated, the way she stresses about social interactions and really like practices what she says and overanalyzes things, the way that like her cognition, her ability to speak, her like motor skills start to degrade when she gets overtired and overstimulated. It definitely reads like autism, or at least like some kind of sensory processing condition. So she tries very hard to mask this and hide this, and she's like in her 30s, and she is like she's not a mage technically. She's kind of like a mage in training, but she hasn't declared. She keeps refusing to advance to the next level. She definitely has the experience and the skills to be a mage, but there's like institutional barriers or challenges, and then also just like personal growth things that have prevented her from taking that next step to becoming a mage. And she is sent on this kind of espionage mission, because they think that like somebody is trying to upset the election of the new like mage leader, and they send her to like the rival, or not rival, but like one of the other genres of magic in the world, to kind of try and investigate it. And like along the way she's kind of like, why me? Like, I'm not skilled at this. My social skills are fucking atrocious. Like, what the fuck's going on that they would send me? It's like they're not actually interested in finding out what happened, because why the fuck would they send me? So that's part of her challenge. Is like she does take this task seriously, but she's also like, what the fuck's going on that they would send me? That's weird. The magic system in this world I struggled with. It's very vague. It's a very soft magic system. And like, oh, she's from Tower Arc, and then there's like Tower Breath and Tower something else, and that kind of determines like your category of magic. But it's not like, you know, it's not like it's potions versus charms versus animal magic. It's like Arc Breath is secrets, intention, feelings, and then Tower Arc is I don't know, I don't even remember because it's like, this is confusing and I don't really understand it, but it's like, arc is like connection, travel, building. Like, it's based on like concepts rather than like actual tangible actions or skills or materials that you use. It's interesting, but I don't think it was, and there's moments where they do kind of explain it, but I don't think we see enough demonstrations of how is this magic different than that magic, different from that magic. Especially because our main character has now studied at like 3 different towers. So her magic is a combination of a bunch of things. So I struggled with that. I kind of just had to be like, that's not the focus of the story. The focus of the story is this character's journey and her self-maturity, her personal growth. That's the focus of the story, and the magic is just kind of background. Another thing that I do really like about this book is there is a ton of non-binary and gender spectrum representation. Like, our character, she uses she or E pronouns, so I could also say that E uses E pronouns sometimes, and characters that use multiple pronouns, the author actually does use interchangeable pronouns to address them, and there are people who, and the way they categorize their gender, it's not like masculine to feminine. It's like you have your like earth genders and cloud genders and water gender. I don't know if they actually have a water genders, but like they're not categorized on a masculine to feminine binary spectrum. I thought it was very interesting, and I definitely would recommend this book if you're looking for non-binary and non-gender binary characters in a non-gender binary world where everyone is a part of this very all-encompassing spectrum rather than like a binary spectrum. I also kind of struggled with the writing a little bit. There were some times I would come across a sentence that grammatically just didn't fucking make sense. It just didn't fucking make sense. And I think I started to pick up on, I think what happens sometimes is as our character gets overstimulated and gets tired, like the way that she describes things and the way that she interprets things, like I think the grammar, the sentence structure does kind of change for that, which I think is an interesting idea. But I highlighted a couple of moments where I'm like, I literally cannot understand what you're trying to say. Like, you could remove the sentence from the paragraph and suddenly I would understand what was happening. So I think there's like an editing and a publishing conversation there about accommodating neurodivergent writing and neurodivergent writing styles, and how, and like accepting that this is how the author like interprets the world and is trying to describe it, but then also like, okay, but who are you writing for, and what is the readability of this? Like, I don't know, I think there's an interesting conversation there. And I know that this book is from like a new, very small press, so maybe that affected like their ability to do multiple passes of editing and like fine-tuning of some of that. But that is something else I want to point out. But I also like do want to recommend this book because it's like a small press, and we've got like a neurodivergent, I believe the author is neurodivergent and then writes characters who are neurodivergent and on like a gender spectrum, like an inclusive, tries to write like inclusive, complex characters and worlds. So I think it's worth checking out, but I also want to like be like, yes, there were some points in the writing where I didn't know what they were trying to say, and then I found the magic system to be not the best explained part of the world. But overall, I thought it was like a sweet adventure, and I did really love the character growth and like the growth and confidence of our main character. I will definitely keep an eye on this author and check out more books in the series. Then I read The Romance, A Reckless Match by Kate Bateman. This was a fun A fun adventure story with some steaminess, but like not too much. And this follows two people from rival families. Like not even like Romeo and Juliet. Like this is more like rival families that have like contested land on each of their borders, and like it's almost become like a game. Like they talk about like the way their fathers like enjoyed the rivalry between their families, and that now our young woman and young man, that is part of their dynamic, is they like butting head, and they're discovering that this thing that's supposed to be animosity is actually like a thing that they enjoy and they like, and that they're not actually enemies. They just kind of like, they like sparring with each other, you know? And our young woman has an interest in, this is a historical fiction, but she has an interest in archaeology. She likes to like do excavations and explore like ruins on their vast tracts of land. And she and the young man discover a smuggling ring on the coast of their property, and they kind of try to interfere and devise a plan. But then like one of the like authority figures that they tell is involved in it, so things go to hell and they get stuck in a cave together trying to escape. And my one critique of this is when they're finally intimate with each other, I'm like, you just said that you're covered in dirt and like coal dust, and you're gonna do that? Sir, wash your hands before you do that, please. You literally just discovered a pool of water. Please wash your hands. That was like my only critique, was like, I know it's supposed to be fluffy and I'm not supposed to read too much into it, but someone's gonna get an infection. That's not good. Personal detail that I latched onto. But overall, this was like a lot of fun, and I would read more books in the series. I think it was like Beautifully Bookish Bethany talked about, like, this book has really good banter between our two leads, and yeah, that's true. Like, you come for the banter and you stay for the happy ending. This was fun. Then I reread the 5th season. This will be reading it for the 3rd time for me, and this time I read it on audio. This is narrated by Robin Miles. I'm not gonna say much more about it except like this is still probably one of my favorite fantasy series ever. I think like the world and the way the world is built is complex, but it fucking makes sense like once you really get into it, and just the way that these various themes are incorporated. Oh, I got 15% battery. Okay, it's great. Audio great. Moving on. Okay, then I read A Master of Djinn by P. Djeli Clark, which I think is technically maybe the 3rd book in the Dead Djinn universe. I think The Haunting of Tramcar 15 technically comes before this one. So this is a full-length novel in this universe, and we follow Fatma as they investigate a figure that claims to be like the historical figure that broke open the door between worlds and allowed the Djinn and the angels to come in. Apparently someone posing as him has shown up and then killed this like secret society of super rich white European people who are residing here in Cairo, and that's like, and the killing is like super weird and ritualistic. So they're investigating like, who is this person? They can't actually be who they claim to be, but they have all these powers. It basically felt like Legend of Korra, whatever season it is, where she's dealing with that guy who he claims to like not be a bender, but then it turns out that he's actually like a waterbender or a bloodbender or something. I don't remember. I will put like a picture of the bad guy and then like what season that is. It felt like that kind of plot line, but like not in a they ripped it off, but just like, you know, if you're gonna compare it to, hey, if you liked the adventure and the mystery of this story, you might like the adventure and mystery of this novel. Now, something I like, but also something that I think was a detriment to how long this book was the amount of history incorporated into this world. You can definitely tell that the author has done a ton of research, and again, like, I wish I had more context to know, because like this book takes place like a little bit later, and it's like right before World War One. So we're seeing like, you know, Europe and Germany and the Middle East, you know, the and like how those powers are all kind of have a lot of tension between them. So I like the incorporation of history, but there was a lot of history info dumping, and I think that could have been toned down a lot. Like, I came here for the fantasy, not the history. Like, some of the history is great, but there was a bit too much for my taste. But still, love Fatma, queer icon, still a fun time. I would elaborate more, but we're running out of battery. Nope, I'm gonna have to charge my phone because the next book, it's gonna take a while for me to explain. Okay. The next book I finished was another NetGalley arc. This is the audio for A Half-Built Garden by Ruthanna Emrys, narrated by Kate Handford. Now, this is a sci-fi novel that's being compared to the works of Ursula K. Le Guin. Of what I've read, I would also compare it to the fiction work of Carl Sagan. I've only read one of his fiction works. I read Contact. But I feel like the pacing and the thoughtfulness and the questions that are addressed have a very similar feel. So this is a book that takes place in a somewhat future, maybe 50, 100 years into the future of our current world model. And it follows first contact with an alien species by a woman who is a queer Jewish woman who goes out for a walk with her baby and her partner, and they they are the first people to make contact with this alien species whose spaceship has landed on their land. And what's interesting about this future world is it's kind of like a climate change hopeful book, and that's kind of a theme of the entire book, where the world has now been divided into we still have like nation states, but we have a lot of like watershed networks, and actually this woman is like a leadership figure in the Chesapeake watershed network. Activism, climate accountability has kind of taken hold, so the world is now nation states, watershed networks, natural networks, and then the corporatist nation states they've gone and isolated themselves onto their own like protected island nations, and they still exist because they do manufacture a few technological components that the other world powers have not been able to replicate. But corporations no longer have ultimate control over what happens over the planet, and while it is still in process, human beings are finally undoing a lot of the harm that we have caused from giving into corporatist demands and living off of fossil fuels and overproducing. So it's kind of like a hopeful future of the people who wanted to stop destroying the planet and overconsuming actually managed to wrest power away from the people who refused to allow for change. And so we have this woman and her family, and it's actually very fortunate that she's out there with her baby, because the aliens who land, they end up calling them the Ringers, I believe, because they're from various space station ring colonies. The Ringers bring their children everywhere, and there's actually initially a very huge conversation of like, yes, we bring our children everywhere. It's actually very helpful in negotiations, because children will interrupt things when they get too tense, too heated, when people are yelling. You are less likely to cause harm to the other person if they are literally holding their child in front of them. And children are also a reminder of like, what are your core values? What is the world that you want to build? So these aliens, initially they look like they landed because there was like some damage to their ship, but it's actually revealed that they have come to, quote, save humans from living on a planet. And there's this huge argument over the whole course of the novel that living on a planet is unsustainable. There's finite room, there's finite resources. It is the inevitable evolution of a sentient species to leave your planet and live in space. And the aliens are kind of, they're trying to be benevolent, but it's a point of conflict and a point of argument over the whole of the book, that like they've come to help you by kind of forcing you along to leave your planet. And the humans, the argument is like, no, we're just starting to get things right. We're not ready to leave, at least as an entire species. We're not ready to leave. And even though there's valid arguments of like, yes, there are limits on our growth, and to live in perfect balance seems unattainable. I love that there's the conversation of like, but we still have so much left to learn by trying. And we are in the early days of learning how to live in balance, not just with nature, but with each other, how to make decisions as a group for the good of the group, how to incorporate everyone's voices. There's some interesting examples of technology, of like neural networks, of, you know, basically like chat rooms with lots of moderators, and like almost like the good version of ultimate Reddit threads of asking questions, farming out information, farming out decision making, up votes, down votes, to make collective decisions. It's a very interesting solution that this author has come up with. As they're going along doing this, of course, the nation states get involved, like NASA gets involved in alien contact, and then, of course, the corporate nations get involved. And the aliens also want to build like a radio transmitter, and the corporations are very much like, of course, we'll give you land, we'll give you whatever you need. Like, they're very much like, future trade, future, you know, resource exchange, future trade. They're all about gain. They're all about like how they can benefit, and they market it like, well, it's a benefit to you too, but it's really, they're still about as much benefit as they can garner from this new potential resource. So they become major players in this conversation, and yeah, so that's kind of like the story of like eventually trying to convince the aliens to not force human beings to make a decision that they're not ready for. And there's a lot of like conversations in here that are thinly veiled about like, you know, colonialism, and maybe not like white supremacy because we're talking about aliens, but the idea of like, just because this thing works for you doesn't mean it's right for you to force this on us. Doesn't like you like. And also the aliens, they're not just one species, they're a symbiotic relationship of several species. So kind of like using their own example of like, remember the first time you guys met, you know, you weren't integrated, you weren't assimilated overnight. And really unpacking that word assimilate and what that means and what the ideal version of that looks like. How do people exchange the good of each other without forcing the bad, or without, you know, removing what's valuable to someone else's culture and just replacing it with what you have determined to be valuable, without really understanding what is potentially going to be lost. There's also very interesting future conversations about gender, about family dynamics. So our lead woman, she's kind of in, not necessarily it's not like a polyamorous relationship, but it's like a co-parenting relationship where like she and her partner are living with another couple who have children, and as a group they are raising children together. So they're really examining usual family structures. There's also quite a few trans characters and non-binary characters. Actually, what the corporations have done with gender is very interesting. It's totally like, I could totally see that being how the conversation around gender identities, gender pronouns and everything, I could totally see corporations taking that, and instead of turning it and using it as a method of self-expression, using it as a method of power and negotiation. It was fascinating. So yeah, anyway, I really fucking liked this book. I really fucking liked it. It is quite, it's kind of slow paced. It's very thoughtful. It's very much about ideas and negotiation and forming arguments and debates. But I think it's very interesting. I feel like I wish that I was of more influence so I could recommend this book to Lena Norms for her No Books on a Dead Planet project, where she and another person read some kind of book, fiction or nonfiction, that kind of talks about like climate change and climate catastrophe and overconsumption and stuff like that. Because I feel like this book would fit really, really well, but it's, you know, it's fiction and it's science fiction, so it would target a very different audience than people who read like only nonfiction. Yeah, it's beautiful. I really liked the narration. This author has written quite a few other things, so I need to like look into what else this author has written, because I really like her ideas. Yeah, I hope this book gets some good buzz. It has some really good ideas in there, and I really liked it. All right, last book, the book I just finished yesterday. I listened to the audiobook of The Death of Vivek Ojie by Akwaeke Emezi, and this was narrated by Yetide Badaki and Chukwudi Iwuji. So this is a contemporary fiction that follows kind of like a whole family in Nigeria. And the opening scene is that Vivek Ojie's mother finds his body stripped naked but wrapped in a sheet, beaten and bloody and dead on her doorstep. And the book is kind of this mystery of, you know, what led to his death, who brought his body, what happened. And part of discovering that is discovering the journey of Vivek Ojie as a queer person in a country where it's very dangerous to be queer. He has a complicated relationship with several of his cousins, and one cousin in particular. So trigger warnings for like, so I get content warning for incest, but like it's not toxic for what that's worth. But it's mostly conversations about queerness, but it's revealed that like Vivek Ojie he's definitely not a cis man, and you know his family has a lot of trouble with that, and in this journey to find himself he knowingly puts himself in danger. And I think like that's what's actually really beautiful about this story. I think it's very interesting. It's like a sad story, and you know it doesn't end happy, but I think there's also like some safety in knowing that he dies at the end, because you don't wonder, you already know what happens, so you're just kind of on this discovery of learning who was Vivek Ojie and what happened. But knowing how it ends, it removes some tension that can make it feel too uncomfortable. And there's like a really, especially towards the end when his parents are finding out exactly what happened to him, it's a very great conversation about, you know, even if you don't really fully accept your queer or trans child, there is a parent's responsibility to like know their child and like accept who they are. Which I said, like, there's something about like not accepting them, but it's like you can recognize and accept the truth of who they are, even if that doesn't magically make their world safe, even if that doesn't magically make everything comfortable. But just like the unique grief of not just losing a child, but realizing that you lost them because you failed to understand them. Anyway, Akwaeke Emezi's writing is immaculate. It's amazing. Like their setting descriptions and their emotional descriptions and everything, the way they just craft a story is beautiful. They're absolutely one of my favorite writers. So yeah, I'm finally glad I got around to reading it. I put it off just because like contemporary fiction, and then like contemporary fiction about a queer person who dies in the beginning and the end is like not really buzzwords for content that, you know, if it wasn't that I knew I love this author, I might not have picked it up based on the premise alone. But yes, It's absolutely worthy of its good reviews and attention. It's beautifully written. It's not very long. It's a fairly short book, so if you're trying to dip your toes into contemporary fiction or something, like, this might be a good one because it's not very long, and the writing is beautiful, but not like so flowery that it's challenging. It's just, Emezi really has a talent for very beautifully flowing language. So great. Okay, that's it. Those are the books I read. Hopefully I can edit this video down into something that's not 2 hours long. Okay, let me know if you've read any of these, or if any of these are on your TBR that you're excited to get to. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious, and I will catch you folks in my next video. Bye!